Okay, so thank you all for coming. What we have here tonight is the first lecture in a series of events that we're doing, and these are special sessions on human rights and drug policy that we're holding here at the University of Essex. And this lecture tonight is the first of these. It's part of a project that's being done together with the Human Rights Centre at the University of Essex and the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy. And the two have partnered for this project, but many future projects hopefully as well over the next years. This is a project that is meant to promote teaching and research and discourse, not just in the postgraduate student community, but wider as well in the area of human rights and drug policy. It's also a project that supports a journal, the very first and only international peer-reviewed journal on human rights and drug policy. It's called Human Rights and Drugs. And you can find it online. We're also, for the students here, we're also soon going to be announcing an internship part of this project, and the internship is going to be open to any and all the human rights postgraduate students. And in fact, I think, Nancy, it's going to be a paid internship, right? Yes, so unlike most exploitation internships that you're familiar with in the world of human rights, this is actually going to be a paid internship. So you'll get an email about that soon. Generally speaking, work on human rights and drug policy is a relatively new area, and it cuts across so many different aspects, some of which you're going to hear tonight, and things that those of you that are studying human rights will be familiar with, everything from the right to health through to violence in Colombia and Mexico and armed conflict, over to issues of death penalty, treatment of detainees, economic, social, cultural rights, indigenous rights. So it really cuts across almost all aspects of human rights that we research and teach and learn here, and you'll see some of that this evening. We've got two excellent speakers here, and I'll introduce them both, and then I'll shut up and sit down for the rest of the evening because I want to hear what they have to say as well. And the first of these is Rick Lines, and Rick is the co-director and co-founder of the International Centre on Human Rights and Drug Policy. He's also, as part of his day job, he's also the executive director of Harm Reduction International in London. Rick's been working in this and related areas for many years. He's done a lot of work in the area of HIV, AIDS, and has worked in areas of prisoners' rights, harm reduction, death penalty for drug offences. He's held senior posts with non-governmental organisations in Canada, Ireland, the UK. He's been technical assistance advisor on HIV in prisons for a number of UN agencies. And he is a member of the technical advisory group to the Global Commission on HIV and the Law, as well as being a core member of the reference group to the United Nations on HIV and injecting drug use. So he has a wealth of practical and academic experience in this area, and he's going to talk more generally about human rights and drug control. And the second speaker we have today is Mr. San-Ho Tree, and he is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in the United States and director of its drug policy project. This is a project which works to end the domestic and international so-called war on drugs, and look at policies that promote public health and safety rather than concepts of war on drugs. And I'm sure he'll be talking more about that. It focuses on issues such as the collateral damage from the war on drugs of the United States and that damage that it causes in countries such as Colombia, Bolivia, Mexico, Afghanistan, and others. It also looks at domestic drug policy, developing new mechanisms to try and get past, and we were talking about this over dinner a little bit last night, the difficulties that we have to have any real and honest discussion of these issues in the political arena. As soon as you start talking about drug issues and drug and human rights, people sort of have knee-jerk reactions, and you don't have honest and sustained debates, and that's part of what the project is trying to overcome. Mr. Tree has featured in all sorts of documentary films on this topic. He's been in many print and broadcast interviews. He has a background that goes beyond this area to anything from being a former military and diplomatic historian, but he's also worked with, I hope you know who Harry Belafonte And he's worked with Harry Belafonte on a couple of projects as well. He was an associate editor of Covert Action Quarterly, which is an award-winning magazine of investigative journalism. And in the 80s, he worked in the International Human Rights Law group. So again, a lot of experience there to talk about this topic. And as I said, I will now join you in the audience, and we'll hear from our two speakers. So Rick's going first.
What did I just tell? Thanks very much, Noam, and thanks for everyone coming out tonight. I'd like to thank Nancy Prudhomme, who's our project director here at the Center for Human Rights and Drug Policy. And as Noam said, this is the first, we hope will be a series of lectures, maybe even evolving hopefully into taught courses on various issues related to human rights and drug policy. I'm going to take about 15 minutes and just try to do a real whirlwind overview of history, law, human rights in the context of drugs. I imagine most of you are human rights students, so you're well familiar with issues related to human rights law and the human rights law regime. I'm going to be talking about a different yet parallel legal regime, which is the international drug control regime, and see where those actually intersect with some of the issues that you might be more interested in terms of your own human rights studies. Start off with a photograph here. The person on your right you probably recognize, Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN. Person on your left, I doubt anyone here probably recognizes. 5 quid. Anyone who recognizes him? I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. He actually just passed away a few weeks ago. His name's Professor Hamid Ghodzi. And up until very recently, he was the president of what's called the International Narcotics Control Board. People are familiar here with treaty bodies within the human rights system. Well, the International Narcotics Control Board is the treaty body that sits within the international drug control system. And Professor Ghodzi, I say up until recently, was the president of that particular body. And for many years, people in civil society and non-governmental organizations have been quite critical of the International Narcotics Control Board for its failure to focus on areas related to health and human rights. And there was an interesting exchange just about 12 months ago in Vienna, Austria, where Professor Ghodzi had an open meeting with members of non-governmental organizations who were in Vienna for a UN meeting. And there had been criticism at that time because a member of the Narcotics Control Board, I think it was in Thailand, had been questioned about the board's position on the death penalty for drug offenses. And this particular member of the Narcotics Control Board had replied that the board didn't have any position on the death penalty for drugs, which of course the United Nations is supposedly an abolitionist organization when it comes to questions of the death penalty. So one of my colleagues, Alan Clear from the Human Rights Coalition in New York, asked Professor Ghodzi a question. And Alan asked, are you saying there's actually no atrocity horrific enough that you will make an opinion about it? You know, legal sanctions in different countries that include extrajudicial killings, torture. Is there no atrocity large enough that you could possibly step outside your mandate and say something? To which Professor Ghodzi replied, no, 100% not. Because basically we're not here to express our opinion. I think it's a question of the mandate of the board, and it's quite clearly stated in the drug conventions. So it's interesting that in this particular exchange, Professor Ghodzi didn't think that the board had a mandate to speak about a very specific human rights issue, which is the death penalty. We know an issue that's addressed within numerous international conventions. Yet in the introduction to the International Narcotics Control Board's annual report that year before, he talked about the people have a right to be free from drug addiction. And I think if you scour sort of the 9 core UN human rights treaties, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find an article anywhere that refers to the right to be free from drug addiction. So when it came to actually offering comment on a very serious and significant issue of international and domestic law, which is the death penalty for drugs, the board would not express an opinion, yet it feels quite free to make up its own human rights and presumably interpret them. And this sort of illustrates a bit about the conflict at the heart of the United Nations on the question of drugs and human rights. On the one hand, the institution is mandated by the international community to promote and protect human rights around the world. It's also the institution that's mandated to enforce the international drug control regime, which we'll talk about. And no point in the calendar is that tension within the system more evident than on the 26th of June every year. In 1987, the UN General Assembly anointed June 26th as the International Day Against Drug Abuse and Illicit Trafficking. This was to coincide with the end of a major UN meeting on drug control. That same day, June 26, 1987, was also the day that the UN Convention Against Torture entered into force. And as we'll see later, that's a particularly resonant moment because of the well-documented cases of torture and inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment related to drugs and drug treatment. But so ironically, in addition to June 26 being the day against drug abuse and illicit trafficking, 10 years later, they also, the UN General Assembly, defined it as the International Day in Support of Victims of Torture to recognize the 10th anniversary of the entry into force of the Convention Against Torture. And this sort of tension within the regime led Professor Paul Hunt, which many of you here I'm sure know well, the former Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, noted that it's imperative in the international drug control system and the complex system of international human rights law that has evolved since 1948 that they cease to behave as though they exist in parallel universes. As in, the human rights side doesn't look at the drug side and the drug side does not look at the human rights side. And unfortunately, that parallel universe very much exists within international law, and it's really part of what our center was set up to try to wrestle with and to hopefully unpick. This tension within the system actually isn't anything new. It dates back to the very foundations of the United Nations itself. This is a picture from the very first General Assembly of the United Nations, and I think it was February 1946, which was held actually in London. And one of the very first items for discussion at that General Assembly meeting was what to do about this man. Anyone recognize him? Franco, very good. General Francisco Franco, the dictator of Spain, had come into power about 10 years before that through a military coup, which had caused a very, very bloody and protracted civil war in Spain, which Franco was victorious in no small part due to the support of the Axis powers in Europe and also corporations in the United States. But unlike the fascist regimes in Germany and Italy who fell after the Second World War, Franco stayed in power. So one of the first questions on the agenda of the General Assembly was what to do in terms of the relationship between the United Nations as a new institution and the government of Spain, which most of the governments at the time did not recognize as the legitimate government of the country. And so the Panamanian delegation put forward a resolution basically proposing that Spain under Franco be debarred from membership in any international agencies established by or brought into relations through the United Nations, and also be banned from participating in any conferences or activities of the United Nations, unless until the time the democratic government of Spain, which had been deposed, was reinstated. And there were lots of wonderful speeches in the General Assembly. You can read the records, talk of how we cannot recognize Spain while Democrats languished in prisons and that sort of thing. And it passed very, very easily, 46-2. I think there was only a couple of Latin American states who voted against that particular resolution. Most likely states probably where war criminals were hiding out at the time. So that was in February 1946. About 6 months later, in Lake Success, New York, we had the third meeting of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. And one of the things that they had on their agenda was to look at how to bring under the auspices of the United Nations the pre-existing drug control treaties that had been agreed under the League of Nations. League of Nations being the international institution that predated the UN, but of course collapsed during the Second World War. And one of the first things on the agenda of this particular meeting was this man. Interestingly, only 6 months after the General Assembly had voted almost unanimously that the UN should have no relationship with Spain at all while Franco remained in power, the governments of China, Czechoslovakia, and the USSR, the Soviet Union at the time, proposed that the Economic and Social Council pass a parallel resolution, essentially recognizing the General Assembly's direction, and that Spain should not be included or be invited to be a party to the drug control regime of the United Nations, which would seem to be a logical extension of what the General Assembly had agreed. This was opposed quite vociferously by a couple of countries, in particular the United Kingdom, did not want to exclude Spain from the protocol. My home country of Canada also did not want to abide by this particular resolution. They wanted to continue to work with Franco on issues of drug control, despite the major human rights and other critiques that had happened at the General Assembly. Very interesting debate because, of course, both Canada and the UK within the General Assembly had spoken very well and had actually supported the General Assembly resolution 6 months before. In the end of the day, the resolution actually passed. They agreed not to engage with Franco on issues of drug control. I think the UK was one of the few that voted against it. I think Canada abstained at the time. But again, we can see even from the very first meetings of the UN, there's been this conflict between what we talk about, human rights and democracy, and how we engage with issues of drug control. This brings us into the modern day. This is the UN headquarters in Vienna. There are 3 UN main centers around the world, the one in New York, which people are probably familiar with, being where the General Assembly is housed. Of course, the center in Geneva, which you're also probably familiar with, where the human rights institutions are housed. This is the one in Vienna, which has the drug control institutions and also the Atomic Energy Commission. As I mentioned before, people here, I'm sure, are familiar with the core international human rights treaties. It might be news to you that there are actually 3 core United Nations drug control treaties as well. The first one in 1961, a following one in 71, and one in 1988. These treaties enjoy almost universal ratification amongst states. And as I say, they form the core foundation of both international and domestic narcotics and drug control. The system sets up a treaty body, which I mentioned at the beginning, the International Narcotics Control Board, which monitors states' compliance with the treaties. It also sets up the drug control system, in addition to the treaties, has a political body. This is the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is a functional commission of the Economic and Social Council. It has, I think, 53 members, state members that rotate. It meets in Vienna once a year in March. And it's a typical kind of UN building. I like this picture because that's actually me. And because one of the things that the drug system in the UN gets critiqued about all the time is how it's very unwelcoming of non-governmental organizations and civil society, as opposed to the human rights regime, human rights treaty bodies, for example, the human rights councils where NGOs can go and present shadow reports, can speak, can ask questions. The drug regime is very closed. And even though I'm sort of in the foreground of the picture here, so you kind of look prominent, actually that's where everyone who's important sits. Because you see, that's all the seats are pointed in there. So this was the one NGO seat which rotated. I think they allowed 2 of us to speak that year. And actually, if you go 3 doors down, this is actually the door to the toilet is right here. And the year following this, I kid you not, the NGO seat had moved 1 step closer to the toilet. So we'd almost be out of the frame. But it gives you an example. You see almost everyone's back is to you when you're actually making your particular intervention. This is another meeting that goes on at the same time as the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. This is called the Committee of the Whole, or the COW, they call it, which we always thought was a bit of an odd acronym. But this is actually the more interesting room. And this is where they actually debate, the countries debate the text of particular resolutions. And this picture was taken in 2008 when for the first time a human rights resolution was debated before the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And it created pandemonium, really, incredible speeches from many of the member states. I'm just going to show a few from China, who was very active on this. And again, it shows that disconnect between the human rights and drug control arms of the UN. The Chinese delegation argued that discussion of political issues such as human rights are inappropriate at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And it's not appropriate to address human rights within the mission of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And it's ridiculous to require us to work in accordance with human rights law. That was where they sat. But they were by far and away not the only ones who were arguing against this. They happened to be the ones whose quotes I jotted down at the time. But there were several countries that argued quite vociferously that human rights is done in Geneva, drugs is done in Vienna, and never the twain shall meet. And we see this tension as well even within the core documents. And this is the preamble of the 1961 Drug Convention, the first of the 3 UN drug conventions. This was the convention that was meant to codify the pre-existing League of Nations treaties. We look for the opening lines here. In the preamble, the convention is concerned with the health and welfare of mankind, recognizing that the medical use of narcotic drugs continues to be indispensable for the relief of pain and suffering, and adequate provision must be made to ensure the availability of drugs for such purposes. So we see terms such as health and welfare, medical use of drugs, provision. These are very, I think, comfortable terms for people like us who work in human rights. These speak very much to human rights concepts, right to health concepts, and something we could all support. But this kind of humanitarian ethos of the first two lines is sort of immediately contradicted by the following two lines of the preamble, which describes that addiction to narcotic drugs is a serious evil for the individual and fraught with social and economic danger for mankind, and that states have a conscious duty to prevent and combat this evil by coordinated and effective measures. And this has always really fascinated me, because you don't really see the term evil used in international treaties. And I started to look, well, let's look at some other international instruments that seek to prohibit or control or eliminate social or political or economic systems that the international community finds abhorrent, and see what kind of language they use. Well, if we look for the word evil in international law, the Slavery Convention of 1926 does not describe slavery as being evil. The Genocide Convention does not describe genocide as evil. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons does not describe nuclear holocaust as evil. The Apartheid Convention doesn't describe apartheid as evil. And of course, the Torture Convention does not describe torture as evil. So genocide, slavery, apartheid, torture are not evil, but drug addiction is evil within international law. So again, what gets us to wonder, when you start to demonize behaviors, demonize health conditions at this kind of level within the international instruments, what is the domestic outcome of that? And it's not even antiquated language from 1961. This was 30 years later from the UN Political Declaration on Drugs. Drugs are a grave threat to the health and well-being of all mankind, the independence of states, democracy, the stability of nations, the structure of all societies, and the dignity and hope of millions of people and their families. I mean, what does that language sound like to you? Does it make you think today of the kind of language you see used around terrorism, for example, in the last 10 years? Very similar kinds of rhetoric in a lot of the documents. So just to conclude really quickly, I mean, what are the human rights consequences at a national level of defining drug use or drugs as an evil that must be fought through coordinated action? Well, one of them is the use of the death penalty for drugs. There's 33 states in the world that have enshrined the death penalty for drugs in legislation. Most of those states don't use it, but those that do execute, we estimate, perhaps up to 1,000 people a year, despite the fact that the UN human rights system has said definitively that drug offenses do not constitute the threshold of most serious crimes for which the death penalty can be legally applied. Question of arbitrary detention for people under the guise of drug treatment. There's estimated to be about 500,000 people around the world who are arbitrarily detained without charge, without trial, in essentially prisons and camps, supposedly for drug addiction, in countries such as China, Malaysia, Vietnam, Russia, India. In many cases, human rights monitors have documented not only abusive practices in human integrating treatment in these centers, but forced labor as well. Torture, cruel, and human integrating treatment or punishment. My organization, Harm Reduction International, has documented the practice of judicial corporal punishment in at least a dozen countries around the world, where people can be beaten, caned, or flogged for drug offenses, including in some countries actually relapsing from abstinence-based drug treatment. Something that my organization, as Noam mentioned, does a lot of work on is the right to health for people who use drugs. HIV, we know, is spread very efficiently through the sharing of dirty syringes. That's why in many countries around the world we have programs such as needle exchanges to give people who inject access to clean syringes as a prevention mechanism, or access to methadone, so it's a medicine to take as a substitution for street heroin. But in many countries of the world, people who inject drugs are denied access to that. Just one example that is probably the worst, most egregious example internationally is Russia, where we know we have about 2 million people who inject drugs. Over a third of them are living with HIV as a result of unsafe injecting drug use, and the government of Russia refuses to implement harm reduction programs of any kind. Which leads me to my final slide. Again, This time the person on the left you probably recognize, and the person on the right you don't. The person on the left obviously is the Pope. The person on the right is Mr. Yuri Fedotov, Russian diplomat, career Russian diplomat, who is now the head of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, which within the United Nations family, in addition to leading on issues such as human trafficking, corruption, terrorism, also leads on drug control, obviously, and is also supposed to be the lead agency on what we call harm reduction, HIV prevention for drug users. Mr. Fedotov, as I say, is a career diplomat for the country that is perhaps one of the worst and most egregious violators of the right to health at this point in time when it comes to injecting drug use and the rights of people who inject drugs. And the Catholic Church, for those of you who've been to UN meetings, has played a particularly conservative and unhelpful and even obstructionist role in debates around HIV within the United Nations. Most recently at the high-level meeting around HIV of the General Assembly, I think it was 2 years ago, where the Catholic Church at that meeting opposed basically every mention of anything related to harm reduction or safer sex or sexual reproductive health. And I like to close with just this one quote from Tvetan Todorov, the Bulgarian philosopher. As I said, the title of my presentation at the beginning was the idea of delivering us from evil, looking at the concept of evil within the drug control conventions. And Todorov said, the most frequently recited Christian prayer in the world, the one that begins with an address to God as our Father who art in heaven, ends with a petition fraught with meaning, deliver us from evil. This implies that there's an evil element in human nature from which God can free us, and we pray to him that he will do so. Human beings, as we know, have sometimes been tempted to take upon themselves this purifying role, and we are all well aware of the catastrophic results. So I'd like to thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Rick. That was a great setup. And thank you, Noam and Nancy, for inviting me and to the International Center and the university as well. I've been working on this issue for about 14 years now, and I think what the problem Rick set up beautifully. What should be a rational discourse about this policy? What are some of the main problems? And I want to talk about why this continues to go on. Because this is one of the most interdisciplinary problems I've ever studied. And it's important when you're looking at something this complex to look at the motivations of each of the individual actors in this process, whether it's the politicians or the farmers or the traffickers or law enforcement. There are lots of different motivations involved. And if you want your adversary, if you want someone to stop doing something, it's important to understand why they're doing it to begin with. Right? Otherwise, you can't get inside their logic loop and figure out what it is that you need to do to get them to stop. Or even worse, that you might not realize that your current policies are actually increasing the motivations of the people involved in these activities. You don't want to amplify the motivational feedback loop, for instance, of drug traffickers, and which is unfortunately what the current policies do. So I want to look at this from various perspectives. I'll start with the peasant farmers. For many years, especially under the Bush administration, the United States carried out an aggressive campaign of drug eradication in countries like Colombia and Peru, Afghanistan. And the debates in the United States Congress were always about the narco-terrorists. We have to go after narco-terrorism. They didn't talk about family farmers. They didn't talk about their motivations or their realities. It was all just evildoers. I mean, just to resurrect that word again. And if you stop and look at what these farmers are doing and why they're doing it, it makes perfect sense from their point of view. They're doing what's in their economic interest. First, these are farmers who live in very remote areas very often, parts of the world that have been historically abandoned by the state. Thank you. That's great. That's good. All right. That's the picture I wanted to show you. Well, for years I talked about lack of infrastructure, what it means to live far away from access to communications, transportation, refrigeration, things that you would need in order to have a viable farming economy and export economy. So these farmers live in remote areas where you could walk for days and not see any sign of the state. If you walked outside of this building and looked around, you'd see signs of the state every direction you looked. You'd see paved roads, running water, electricity, police, hospitals, schools, all these things that make modern life possible. And when you're talking about peasant farmers in these very remote areas, they live in a different reality. This is a main road in the province of Guaviare, Colombia. This is a couple of miles away from the provincial capital. And to get to the southern part of the province, the capital's at the northern tip, to get south, where thousands of families and farmers live, you have to go through these roads. And I took this in 2009 during the dry season. So you can imagine what the rainy season is like. And if you're a peasant farmer, you have to be very, very, very lucky to live, to have a farm near this road. Right? So most farmers are several kilometers away from this kind of infrastructure. And so you can imagine the kind of pathways they have to traverse. And to grow legal crops, which is what we want them to do, to grow pineapples and yucca and hearts of palm, whatever, they have to move that from their farms to these roads and hope that a truck or public transportation will come by, they'll have some money to pay them to transport it, and by the time they get to the nearest town, they have to hope that all their neighbors didn't have the same idea and grow the same crop, because the prices then collapse. So the difficulties of the farmers are not insignificant at all. So for them, you can either grow a couple of hectares of coca crops, in this case, or poppies or cannabis, and transport that. You can transport coca paste, which is easy to make. Coca paste is the intermediary form of cocaine that the farmers will make on their farms in a very crude, what they call laboratories, but it's really not a laboratory. It's a drum of gasoline, and they use cement, sulfuric acid, ammonia, a few other basic chemicals to process the coca leaves, to extract the coca paste. And you get a kilo of paste out of this big harvest. And the paste is what you sell to the traffickers, to the middlemen, who will then refine it into pure cocaine to export. But that paste is a kilo. So put yourself in their shoes. Would you rather transport 1 kilo or thousands of kilos of fruits and vegetables to support your family? So from their point of view, this makes good sense. Now, for the traffickers, what motivates them? Of course, that's money, for the most part. But why? Why is it valuable? What we're talking about are essentially minimally processed agricultural commodities that ought to cost pennies per dose, right? Things like heroin, cocaine, cannabis, they're easy to grow. Cannabis, we call it weed for a reason. It grows like a weed. There's no reason on earth why it should be worth this much money. And for things like cocaine and heroin, they're worth many, many, many times their equivalent weight in solid gold. This is insanity. Put it this way, you can buy a kilo of pure cocaine in the streets of Medellin, Colombia for maybe $1,000 to $1,500, give or take. By the time you smuggled that to the streets of the United States, the cities like Washington or Baltimore or New York, and by the time the dealers take that kilo and they cut it into little gram bags and they dilute it with whatever garbage they cut it with, you can get approximately $100,000 to $150,000 for that exact same kilogram. Okay. So what happened? How did this thing get so valuable all of a sudden? Right? And what the users are paying for are essentially transportation costs, or more accurately, the risks associated with the transportation. And this is the catch-22 of the drug war. The more our politicians want to stop these drugs, they throw more law enforcement at this problem, they increase the risk of the drug traffickers, and the higher the likelihood at each stage of the smuggling process that you might get caught, the longer the potential prison sentence or death penalty you might have to face, or the threat coming to you from law enforcement or your own lieutenants. The higher the risk premium you're allowed to charge the next person down the line, right? And so this is how we turn this relatively cheap and easy to produce agricultural commodity into things that are so priceless that are worth, people are murdering each other, wholesale slaughter, especially in places like Mexico, because the U.S. border is one of the most profitable borders to cross, right? If there's very little risk, smuggling from Peru to Colombia is relatively low risk. But if you smuggle from Colombia, you have to cross the U.S. border. That's where a lot the value multiplies tremendously. And so as our politicians continue to increase these sanctions, we actually produce indirect price support for drug traffickers. Right? And you would think we also produce a price support for the peasant farmers as well by eradicating excess coca, excess poppies, and that sort of thing. But unfortunately, there's simply too much reserve population There's an inexhaustible reservoir of poor peasant farmers around the world who live in areas that are abandoned by the state, where there's no law enforcement to tell you can't grow a particular crop. And so because there's so many of them, their risk premiums are rather small. In fact, these peasant farmers receive a tiny, tiny, tiny microscopic fraction of the final street price of these drugs. So it's really the traffickers in the middle that reap the most profit. And these traffickers are motivated, again, by profit margins, and that incentivizes them to evolve at a terrifying pace. There are very few industries outside of maybe high tech that evolve this quickly. So 20, 30 years ago, you had smugglers using fishing boats, for instance. They'd smuggle it in frozen shrimp and fish loads and that sort of thing. And then we started inspecting and capturing those boats. So they switched to go-fast boats, speed boats, that were much faster than the Coast Guard and law enforcement boats. And we got faster boats to catch them. And so then they switched to semi-submersible submarines. Right? They didn't have to go all the way underwater. The conning tower was just enough to get to air, get air for the crew. And during the day, they put a blue tarp over the vessel, and it blends into the ocean, and they travel by night. And you can haul maybe 8 or 10 tons of cocaine at a time doing this. And we started finding new ways to detect even that small conning tower sticking up from the ocean. And now they've moved to fully submersible, proper submarines that can go maybe 50 feet underwater. They don't need to dive very deep. They just need to evade law enforcement. And they're using far more innovative materials. They're using carbon fiber, things that the US Navy doesn't use. So they're evolving very rapidly. Same with the land routes, right? We have been stopping things at the border through better inspection, x-rays, and that sort of thing. So they went under the border. They dig narco tunnels, and there have been more than 100 of them discovered. One discovered last July in Tijuana, Mexico, going underneath to San Diego, was almost finished, and it was incredibly elaborate. They had a rail system, ventilation, electricity, there was concrete on the floor, and they had 40 tons of cannabis on the other side waiting to get to the United States. And those tunnels can also be used to smuggle guns south as well as repatriating cash. So and you can also see how they adapted in terms of land. We built a fence, a border wall, right? And so it didn't take long for the traffickers to realize, well, we just pull up a truck, and we have a steel ramp that'll go right over that wall. And so they did that initially. Then they realized, well, there's also these slits in the wall to let wildlife and wind and that sort of thing pass through. It's about 4 inches wide. And soon we saw smugglers adapt, and their drug packages became 3 3/4 inches wide. Just hand through the wall, through those slots. Then they switched to catapults. I mean, Roman technology, right? They're just catapulting this stuff over the fence, and the person on the other side picks it up, and there you go, you've crossed the border. And they've also switched to the air route. They've gone from small planes initially, and then they would buy old DC-3s or even old jetliners and use them for one-way missions. The profit margins were so high they could just crash land them on the other side and offload the drugs. And now they've adapted to with ultralights, with these small little hang glider type airplanes that carry a couple of 100-pound payload, but they go underneath the US radar, but over the fence, over the wall. Right? So we see this constant evolution, and it's a losing proposition. I mean, one DEA official said, "Look, you try finding about these narco submarines." He said, "You try finding something the size of a log floating in the Pacific Ocean. I mean, these are vast territories. It's very difficult to interdict this stuff. And we only capture a small portion of it." From the point of view of the drug warriors, why are they? What motivates them? And this is a complicated question, because there are a lot of people I've talked to within law enforcement who've been doing this for many years, and privately they tell me it doesn't work. And they don't, but perhaps, we can't stop at the border, but if you talk to the money laundering officials, that's where you do some damage. Then you go talk to people who do the money laundering enforcement. They say, "Oh God, this is hopeless. Money is designed to be a medium of exchange. We can only track so much of it. But if you do eradication, source country eradication, destroy the stuff on the ground, we know where it's growing, that'll do the trick." Then you talk to people who are doing the spray programs and the forced eradication, and it's as effective as shoveling water, basically. There's simply too much territory in this world to grow these things. Colombia, by the way, is bigger than Texas and California combined. The same is true of Bolivia, the same is true of Peru, the major cocoa-producing countries. So these are vast territories, which look small on a map. And when you see the testimonies in the US Congress, they just say, we'll just move these resources here, here, and here, and we'll take care of this problem. Easier said than done. Now, but even though they might privately dissent with the drug war, publicly, their public statements, especially the key bureaucrats who are responsible for testifying in front of Congress, their motivations are very varied. As with most bureaucrats, budget is a big factor. We spend more than $25 billion a year federally in the United States on the war on drugs. We spent more than $1 trillion in my lifetime fighting the war on drugs. And these translate into jobs. And careers, and these people live in congressional districts, and so members of Congress will do whatever it takes to fight to keep jobs in their district. And so the drug warriors then are very keen to keep a lock on the doctrine. Only they know what is the right thing to do, how to run this drug control system. Only they know the proper way to attack the cartels and to do these kinds of things and their coerced treatment and whatnot. Doctrine is key to securing your budget, right? And defending your turf, your bureaucratic turf. And the various bureaucracies fight each other, are quite competitive over these budgets. So doctrine is a way of preserving your career and promotion in your budgets. They also like to keep the same meaningless metrics they've been using for decades now to signify progress. That is to say, they look at how many hectares of crops have we eradicated in Colombia? How many kilos of cocaine have we stopped? How many kingpins have we locked up? But these metrics are not unlike body count in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. I don't know if you're familiar with that. But basically, if you just count the numbers, if you don't look at the motivations of what's causing these people to do these things, then you're basically picking off a few of them, but there's a whole ready replacements willing to take their places. Also, the drug warriors end up creating more efficiency in this market. Right? The drug economy evolves under Darwinian principles, selection of the fittest. And year after year, decade after decade, as we escalate the war on drugs, the kinds of people we typically capture are the kinds of people who are dumb enough to get caught. No offense if anyone's ever been arrested for anything here, but the slang expression on the street is that the dealer who uses loses, right? You'll get careless, you'll get sloppy, you get apprehended eventually. And that's somewhat analogous to what happens at the macro level, that the traffickers we end up capturing are the ones who are the least efficient. They make operational mistakes. They get too violent. They get involved in turf battles and rivalries. They spend money, they're too flashy. And those are the ones we end up picking off. But the end result of that is that the people we typically miss, by and large, tend to be the ones who are the most efficient, the most adaptable, the most innovative. So we've been creating, breeding super traffickers, if you will. That's the end result of this. You can't hope to win a war on drugs when your policies see to it that only the most efficient operations survive. And not only do they survive, but they thrive because, again, we've done two things indirectly to help them. Number one, we've eliminated their competition for them. We've picked off their rivals, the clumsy traffickers, and allowed the most efficient ones to take over that market share. And we've tried to constrict the supply of drugs on the street while the demand remains high, or even increases, thereby driving up prices for these people. Right? So it's a symbiotic relationship, actually. If you look at the relationship between drug warriors and drug traffickers, neither one can make a reasonable living without the other. Right? Without the war on drugs, these traffickers are basically transporting minimally processed agricultural commodities that are cheap to produce. And without drug traffickers and without the war on drugs, these bureaucrats and these drug warriors have to find another line of work. And so there's, in some ways, I mean, the people who want this drug war to end the most, or the least, are the drug traffickers themselves, in my opinion. They also end up reducing barriers to entry. So the drug warriors, they go after kingpins. It looks great on television. You know, President Calderon in Mexico did this for 5 years, parading kingpin after kingpin that they've captured on national television in front of the drugs they've seized and the weapons and that sort of thing. And it's great for politicians. The new president of Mexico says, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to move away from that, which I commend him. That's a bold move because politicians are addicted to that kind of coverage, that publicity, right? But what it does when you get rid of a kingpin is that you lower the barriers to entry for other traffickers. You also create more violence, so the lieutenants of that drug trafficker may vie for power for that organization, and you get shootouts and rivalries. Also, rival cartels will try to take over that market share. And once you weaken one cartel, the others move in. And so this policy of attacking one after another basically makes sure that they never establish or reestablish that equilibrium they once had. You know, drugs have been smuggled through Mexico to the United States for many, many decades. Why is it only this past 5 years we've seen a spectacular rise in violence? There used to be what was called, somewhat cynically, a Pax Narcotica, that under the government of the PRI, the party, which had a monopoly on power in Mexico for almost 7 decades, there was a lot of corruption, but they also had an arrangement with the drug traffickers, a tacit agreement, in some cases more than tacit, that if you didn't engage in violent turf wars, if you didn't engage in extortion and kidnapping and moving in, branching out to other types of crime, causing lots of publicity and violence, and if you bribed the right officials in your region, they would look the other way, as long as you kept to the quiet business of trafficking drugs. And so what current policies do is basically ensure that they will never find that kind of equilibrium, where they'll be, at the end of a turf war, right? Their turf wars have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And what the current policies do, what Calderon's policies have done, is make sure that that middle is prolonged indefinitely, so that you'll never settle those turf disputes and go back to the quiet business of making lots of money trafficking drugs. Now, if one believed, after all this bloodshed in Mexico, and we're talking now about 60 to 120,000 dead in the past 5 years under President Calderon's administration, most of that attributable to drug violence, drug-related violence, or rather prohibition-related violence. If you believe that you're going to eliminate these drug cartels after all this bloodshed, maybe you can make a case for it. But nobody in their right mind is even suggesting that we can come close to doing that. So for what have we, to what end have we been doing this? Because it's a tremendous toll in terms of human suffering, and also what they've done is I think, really tragic. In addition to all the human, tragedies in Mexico, the other victim, the other thing that got destroyed was the social contract, the idea that the state could provide some minimal predictability and security so that people go on with their lives and business and things. And that prohibition-related violence got so spectacularly out of hand, it demonstrated to everyone that the state was incapable. It was incredibly corrupt and also inefficient and unable to stop this kind of violence. And that emboldened other types of criminals, and it also emboldened the cartels to diversify into other types of crime. So now we have human smuggling, we have extortion, kidnapping, all these things. So it's a general breakdown of order, and that takes a long time to repair that kind of damage. It's very easy to burn the social contract. It's much more difficult to build up people's confidence that the state is once again able to establish order. And that's what Colombia's been living through for many decades now. And I fear that Mexico is now in that same trajectory if they don't do something very quickly. But throughout this, a lot of the drug warriors that I talk to find ways to rationalize it. They may know that their particular efforts aren't going to succeed, but they say that, well, for every kilo we stop, that's some drugs at least that won't be getting to our kids, right? These are not, by and large, bad people or evil people. No one wakes up in the morning, or very few people wake up in the morning thinking, I feel really evil today. Smithers, find me a dog to kick. We all think that we're doing something for some greater purpose, even though we have to go through some intellectual gymnastics sometimes to rationalize these things. Now, from the point of view of users, I guess people have more familiarity with that. And most use is not problematic use, and that should be made clear. But in terms of problematic users, I think a lot of what I've seen around the world can be attributed to problems that are rooted in what I call the PDA problem. Not personal digital assistant like my iPhone, but rather poverty, despair, and alienation are at the root of so many social problems, including a lot of the reasons why people self-medicate or cultivate illicit crops. And those are much more profound problems to address, and politicians, by and large, don't like to tackle those kinds of problems, because if you're a politician and you identify a problem, people then look to you for a solution, and it's far bigger than any single politician can address. There is no substitute in the end for building a healthy society, and that's something we've neglected to do for decades, particularly in the United States, and as well as austerity, I think, also it takes its toll. And it's important also to recognize that, all use is not abuse, and abuse is not necessarily addiction, and those are different things and they need to be treated differently. But we have a one-size-fits-all solution very often in many societies because of politicians. And when you get to the point of view of politicians, what motivates them, and why are they so, reluctant to address these problems? Even at the UN level, you see the kinds of games they're playing. And yet privately, when I talk to them, and I've met with maybe 300 or 400 congressional offices now over the years in Washington, and both liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, when the doors are closed and they think no one's listening, then there's a whole different conversation that takes place. And they'll admit to me that they think this drug war is a failure, this will never work. But they can't come out and say this publicly. And in fact, when you see the formal votes, the recorded votes, they very often vote in favor of the drug war when privately they told me that they didn't believe it would work. And that has to do with the political process in the United States, and it also applies to the rest of the world, but there are things about it that make it particularly nasty in the United States. That is to say, our method of campaigning has degenerated in the past 20, 30 years. It's gone straight into the gutter, and it's become much more efficient at attacking and damaging and holding the various parties and factions hostage to extremists, while at the same time our political mechanisms haven't been able to compensate for that kind of dysfunction and extremism. And part of the problem is that the solutions to many of the drug-related problems and many other complicated problems in the world are counterintuitive. That is to say, the obvious solution, the knee-jerk solution of getting a bigger hammer or just hitting them harder, being tough is not the same as being effective. And in fact, it's very often the opposite, right? As we talked about earlier about prohibition economics. And this is one of my favorite speaking props I use when I talk to elected officials, right? To demonstrate the problem of counterintuitive solutions. You've seen these things before, the Mexican finger trap or Chinese finger cuffs they're called, right? The harder you pull, the stucker you get. And that's the problem with drug prohibition, that the more we escalate the drug war, the stucker we get. And it's counterintuitive to think that, well, if you relaxed or even if you pushed in a little bit, that's how you extricate yourself from this problem. Because at the end of the day, particularly in the US system, where you can't hide behind the parliamentary party, you rise or fall on your own, right? Democrats and Republicans can vote against their own party very often. And that means that if they dissent on things, you can't hide behind the party and say, I was just following orders and party discipline, but that you can be attacked individually. And these negative campaign ads, these smear ads, are effective, they're cheap to produce, and they're very difficult to counter. That is to say, you can, one of my favorite popular philosophers, I think, put it well. You've probably heard of him, last name Simpson, first name Bartholomew, right? Bart Simpson runs for class president in an episode of The Simpsons. And he begins with an attack speech against his opponent. And he says, my opponent says there are no easy answers. Well, I say he's not looking hard enough. This is the problem we have with politics in Washington and also internationally as well. That, put it this way, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg was talking about a different controversial issue at home about trade. But he said, look, we all know what needs to be done. We just don't know how to get reelected after we've done it. That's the problem with drug policy. Right? That you can run an attack ad against your political opponent if you want to unseat them in an election very easily. I could say, let's say, Rick here was representing northern or suburban Maryland, and I wanted to unseat him. I was a right-wing Tea Party kind of guy. And I would say, Congressman Lyons doesn't care if your kids are addicted to drugs. He knows where the drugs are coming from. They're coming from Colombia. They're coming from Mexico. Those governments asked us. They begged us to fight this war on drugs. He refused to approve that aid. Come on, folks. We all know where the drugs are coming from. Send me to Washington. I'll approve this money. We'll go down there and clean up this mess, and I'll protect your kids. Now, Congressman Lyons, if he's lucky, in the US system, where campaigns drag on and on and on, it's a perpetual campaign now, has to hope that all the people who saw my negative smear ad run over and over on television and radio are going to tune in to the 6 o'clock news and see his 1-minute soundbite. If he's lucky, he'll get a minute, to counter my complex arguments. That is to say that the ratio of expenditure, and campaigns are very expensive in the United States, of attacker to defender is so grossly disproportionate that it's very difficult to get members of Congress to take up controversial issues, third rail issues. People know what third rail refers to? It's a DC term. It comes from the subway system. 2 rails carry the train. The third one is high voltage. If you touch that rail, you're dead politically, right? So raising taxes, gun control in the United States, policies on Israel, drugs and crime, these are all third rail political issues. And not surprisingly, in climate change as well. And not surprisingly, we have complete dysfunction and breakdown in the US Congress. They can't address these issues. Even though privately they know what the problem is, publicly they remain silent on these issues. So where does that leave us? That today, we are at a moment of tremendous change, something that I didn't expect to see for quite a while longer. But we have now the Global Commission on Drugs, we have Kofi Annan, and we have former presidents of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. We have current presidents and heads of state of Colombia, of Guatemala. They're coming out, and Uruguay, coming out against the war on drugs, calling for a reevaluation. This is unprecedented. It used to be that it wasn't difficult to find former officials, retired law enforcement people, and retired politicians would speak openly about this. But now we're seeing people who still have skin in the game politically coming out and against these policies. We have now cannabis legalization in the state of Washington and in Colorado. And many other states are now looking at these models and will have their own initiatives or legislation to legalize and regulate and tax cannabis. This, I think, is a monumental shift because this is not just something that affects the United States. This now creates political space for other countries in other parts of the world to stand up to the United States, which has been one of the biggest bullies on the war in terms of the international drug war, to say, look, your own citizens are turning their back on these policies. They're clearly not working. And you can't justify, you can't rationalize shoving these policies down our throats because there's all sorts of clawback and reprisals the U.S. has codified in terms of drug certification and penalizing states that don't cooperate with the United States. It's an incredibly oppressive and imperialistic policy that even our own State Department is embarrassed and wish would go away. But Congress wants to make political speeches and grandstand, and so we have this perpetual problem. So this is the rebellion in Latin America. There's tremendous shifts happening. And so that's, it's hard to predict a tipping point except in hindsight. But I think there are ways that you can manufacture tipping points that may be inchoate, that already exist, but people are afraid. So one of the solutions I've worked on is based on something Oscar Wilde once wrote. If you want a man to tell you the truth, give him a mask. Right? Can we give legislators a temporary mask to get their honest opinion on something for a change? So for this 15-minute non-binding procedural exercise, could we, for instance, have a straw poll? Again, I don't support making laws in secret or through anonymous votes, but for a straw poll to get a sense of the body, you can get some very surprising results. And I think the UK Drug Policy Commission did something similar. They surveyed all these MPs, and 3/4 said the drug war is a failure. It isn't working. And how many of them would say so in public, in front of the cameras? But privately, if you give them some cover, they'll be much more honest. And that produces then a tipping point that was already there, but it's been deeply, deeply closeted. In the United States, I'd like to talk about it as, imagine yourself in a convention of gay closeted Mormons. Everyone's terrified. They'll find out that you're gay, but in fact, you're a majority in the room. And once people know that, it changes the discourse in the room, right? So if you had this kind of anonymous straw poll at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna, for instance, which operates on the Vienna Consensus, the famed Vienna Consensus that they're so proud of, which, in my opinion, is a thoroughly coerced consensus because it's a public consensus. It's about posturing, and it's about not ticking off powerful nations that might have ways of reprisals and that sort of thing. It's good enough to elect a Secretary General, a secret ballot, same with the Pope. Why wouldn't you want people to be honest about what they believed? And instead we have this kabuki theater in Vienna that we go through every year. So that's one way to do it. But I'm always looking for different ways to kind of neutralize the polarity of that third rail of politics, because we're now running out of time on so many issues, not just gun control, not just the economy, but also climate change. And so we have to develop mechanisms to compensate for this kind of degeneration of our political system. And so I think I should leave it there, and we'll try to take some questions and see where we go with this. So thank you very much. Let me have a seat.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Are you American?
Yes.
Okay. As a fellow American, I'm wondering if you could just be a little bit more specific on the policy proposals that it sounds like you've put to specific members of Congress, just so I have a clearer idea of the measures you're speaking of. Also wondering if you could speak to the involvement of the American military in like very on the ground involvement in eradication and those sort of activities.
Okay. There are lots of different proposals. This is an incredibly complex problem, and different drugs and different situations require different solutions. And so there's no one single proposal. But in terms of having genuine basic rural development in a lot of these regions would be one step, for instance, rather than punishing them and using spray planes and crop dusters to destroy their crops. You have to give them some reason and some ability to support their families. In terms of the criminal justice reforms, reforming sentencing, those kinds of things, cannabis regulation, I think we're beyond the tipping point now in the United States. We now have more than 51% of the general public in favor of it now. And generationally, we can't even find a member of Congress who can claim, it's very difficult now to find a political candidate who can claim to have been drug-free their entire lives. Right? I agree with the drug czar. Cannabis is a gateway drug. It's a gateway to becoming president. Every president of the United States since 1993 has broken our drug laws in very profound ways, some of them incredibly serious ways that would trigger an automatic mandatory minimum sentence. And the question has to be asked, would a good prison sentence have been good for your life and in your career, Mr. President or Senator? And if not, why is it so good for everyone else, particularly poor people and people of color? Right? So there's a question of legitimacy in these laws now, that generationally it's hard for them to justify these things. In terms of the military, I think it's one of the more interesting things. It's also very counterintuitive. It surprises people when I tell them that, the military is really not thrilled with the drug war. It's a very conservative institution overall, and they certainly, don't support Cheech and Chong, and they're not in favor of, a drug use or anything. But the drug war is it's a career killer. When I talk to my contacts in the Pentagon, one of them told me there are two types of duty you never want to pull if you're a career military. They're career killers. First one is peacekeeping, and the second is counter-narcotics, because neither is a traditional military function. There is no, capital city to capture. There's no flag to take down. There's no river to cross. There's no beachhead to establish. And if you do your job perfectly, no one will notice anything. You don't have car bombs going off. You don't have insurgencies. You don't have drugs all over the place. Everything's normal. You don't get rewarded for normal, right? But the moment something goes wrong, it's like that bar Cheers, everyone knows your name. And the military learned their lesson after Vietnam. Don't stick our butts out there in a line of fire without telling us exactly what it is we need to do before we can declare victory, come home, get our medals and parades and promotions, and get on with our careers. And generationally, they forgot that lesson, unfortunately, when they signed up for the Iraq War. And so another generation had to learn that lesson again, to be aware of open-ended conflicts, things that can't be solved militarily. And I'm afraid the next generation may have to learn it again if we don't start paying attention to history. But nonetheless, there are significant military forces involved in this. And it's generally within what's called SOUTHCOM, the U.S. Southern Command, that basically is in charge of everything south of Mexico and South America. And they're the only part of the military that really gets serious drug war funding. But even within SOUTHCOM, I've talked to officers who are very cynical about it. They don't think this will ever work. But it's the only action they're going to get, because they've seen a lot of their comrades and cohorts getting promotions and seeing action in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that means promotions, and that's how your career advances. And if you're stuck in pulling duty in Latin America, Western Hemisphere, there's not much room for promotion there. I hate to be that cynical about it, but that's part of the motivation. But by and large, they're not thrilled with the drug war.
I have a question for Rick. And this, a lot of this is actually after listening to Sanho and some of the thoughts that come up. I wonder, Rick, for you in your work, whether, and this is, I guess, both a strategic and a personal question in terms of how you view it, whether you think there's almost a tension between the notion that actually the whole sort of war on drugs is a failure. We need to be thinking more of various routes of legalization and or decriminalization and so on, versus the more, let's call it, symptomatic approach of, well, there's a problem over there of detention. Over there, they're torturing drug users. Over here, there's an issue of right to health, but it's really symptomatic treatment where perhaps the root cause is something bigger. And whether from a human rights perspective, and sort of working on the sort of human rights and drug policy, should the focus perhaps be less on the symptomatic treatment of these issues and more on the big push to change the underlying problem? And do you feel a tension between working on the two?
No, it's a good question. I think it's something that certainly myself and some of my colleagues talk about a lot at the moment. And as Sanho mentioned, there's a current sort of political momentum to look at drug law reform in different ways. So the question then becomes, well, what does that actually mean? And I think one of the first things you see when you sort of look at different states who are interested in opening up drug law reform is drug law reform often means different things to all those countries. So a good example is recently the government of Bolivia denounced the 1961 Drug Convention. The 1961 Drug Convention has an article in it which prohibits the traditional indigenous use of coca. And within the Andean Aboriginal cultures, coca is a traditional crop. It has traditional uses. It has traditional medicinal uses. Make tea with it. And Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, himself comes from indigenous communities, has a background in growing coca. And so he was very dedicated to saying, well, we need to remove our obligation under the 1961 convention to criminalize coca growing amongst indigenous populations. Because it's not linked to the drug, manufacturing cycle. It's not linked to the drug industry. It's a traditional indigenous crop which exists in a traditional and very specific context. And so what Bolivia did just within the last couple of years is they denounced the 1961 convention and then immediately, 30 days later, re-ratified the treaty, but with a reservation on coca. And this prompted a lot of debate in some quarters. But of course, like any treaty, when you issue a reservation to the treaty, other states that are party to the treaty can choose to oppose you issuing that reservation. And it was interesting because one of the countries that opposed the reservation was Mexico. So on the one hand, for example, you have the president of Mexico, as I was saying, talking about trying to take a different way towards dealing with drugs and opening up options of drug policy reform. Yet the government of Mexico denounced what I think for President Morales was actually a very human rights compliant way of trying to sort of observe the drug conventions in a way that respected indigenous cultures, particularly in the context of the drug convention being ratified in '61 when Bolivia was dictatorship, and of course dates the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, for example, or the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So, that denunciation and re-ratification is a good example of trying to incorporate human rights obligations within a drug context. But then again, Mexico, which supports drug reform to some degree, objected to that reservation. Or you see that with European countries, for example, that are very big on things such as harm reduction, which is I work in like health programs for drug users, but at the same time I might often be very critical of Latin American countries' approaches to drugs. So even within that sort of context, or the Latin American countries, when you go to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, will often oppose language in resolutions around needle exchange programs, for example. So you have even what means drug reform to different countries that are in favor of some sort of change. That's not necessarily to assume that they're all envisioning the same thing. And I don't necessarily think that's a problem with that. As you're saying, you can pick off the pieces. But then the question, I think the risk becomes, do you end up driving one particular way, and does that then subsume a more total analysis of the situation? So in the US, for example, we have, say, the cannabis initiatives, the ballot initiatives. And obviously cannabis reform is always sort of very high on the agenda because it's such a commonly used drug. But the question then, if cannabis reform takes on the mantle of drug reform, is that actually a good thing? Or does that mean that drug reform happens more broadly in all these kinds of ways Sano's talking about? Or does that mean that we have some sort of cannabis regulation and it cuts off any broader discussion of other kinds of drug policy reform? So, okay, we'll have cannabis in some sort of decriminalized situation or maybe even a regulated market, but heroin is still bad, and cocaine is still bad, and crack is still bad, and we're still going to do all the things you're saying. We're going to build the wall. We're going to put the military into Colombia. We're going to eradicate crops. So I think for me, I think it's very much part of thinking about how do you interpret that broadly within a human rights context. And I think one of the problems with the way the drug treaties work is it sort of presumes, or it eliminates the opportunity for countries to actually do individual things. You know, so for example, if you look at Latin America where they have security problems, it makes sense that the driving issue for them around drug policy reform is related to violence. Whereas in Eastern Europe, for example, where the issues are around HIV and injecting drug use, it makes sense that people interested in drug policy reform would be more interested in that aspect of it than they would be around maybe fighting drug cartels with the military. But within the current legal framework, it's a one-size-fits-all approach to every country, and it really minimizes or eliminates the flexibility of countries to deal with their own individual systems, whether that's related to human rights or excesses or problematic social consequences of drugs.
Thank you. Well, just a comment first regarding to the militarization. Well, in my point of view, is the beginning. It's so clear that this doesn't have a role to play in this drug war. But certainly when you realize that there are proofs that most of the integrates or individuals who are part of these cartels or criminal drugs have been trained by militaries as well. So in those cases, which could be the best result? And here comes my question. Which can be the role of the police? Which kind of approach, which kind of activities could they follow in those cases? And sorry, another question as well. Well, it is a fact that in Latin America, drug war has its own characteristics, its own identity. Sorry, I have just wrote it because it's difficult. But this is because it has a deep link, not only with the political and historical characteristics of each of the states in the region in Latin America, but also because the specific relationships between the states. And in this case, what do you think about the regional cooperation in this area to face this phenomena?
It's interesting, this idea of the military versus police function and corruption. Drug prohibition, in my opinion, is an equal opportunity corrupter. That is to say, the profits are so extreme, and the salaries, particularly in many Latin American countries, of law enforcement and the military are so incredibly low that the traffickers can easily bribe their way and get whatever they want. They don't have to fight overtly, right? There are the the saying is, plomo o plato. Do you want silver or do you want lead? Do you want a bullet or do you want a bribe? And in countries like Mexico and Colombia, where the impunity rate for politically motivated killings is above 90% or 98% historically, these kinds of threats are not taken lightly. These are not idle threats. They will kill you if you don't take the bribe. So is that corruption? I don't know. Depends on how high up you are on that chain, I guess. If you are doing it simply because you have no alternative and you want to see the sun rise the next day and see your children the next day. But there are also people at the top who don't need to take these kinds of bribes, who are thoroughly corrupted. So when I go to talk to congressional staffers, I'll sometimes joke and say, look, can you name me the last Mexican drug czar that wasn't on the payroll of the cartels? It's harder to find the exception, right? So that the training is something that is fungible, right? So the United States helped train the Mexican special elite counter-narcotics forces, including what became the Zetas, who are the most feared and the most violent. I mean, there's spectacular violence going on in the drug war in Mexico, but the Zetas are, they're clearly above all the others in terms of the brutality. And a lot of them some of them, the initial founders, were trained either directly or indirectly by U.S. Special Forces, and they took that training and adapted it to their own needs, and they recruited more people from the police and the military and others and gave them that specialized training. And so this is the story that we need to be very careful about who we train, because if you can't guarantee their loyalty at the end of the day, you've given away the game. Right? It only takes one or two bad apples, particularly if they're in a strategic place within the bureaucracy, to be able to give away the game to the traffickers. Right? And sometimes it's very high. You can vet all the colonels and majors and captains you want, but if it's the general, or if it's the attorney general, or it's the vice president that's on the payroll of the cartels, all they have to do is sit down at the morning briefing and say, okay, tell me, what are we up to next? Who are we hitting next? And you've lost it, right? And so, so whether it's police or military, well, I think it's a lot. Domestic law enforcement should not be a role of the military. They're not trained to enforce laws. But on the other hand, the police, and particularly in Mexico, terrible corruption problem, and they're underpaid. But if you decriminalized, if you ended drug prohibition, you would take most of the profits would evaporate from this industry. So that solves, to a great extent, a lot of the violence, the drug-related violence problem from the cartels. But on the other hand, it becomes a public health problem, which it is one way or the other, either way. And so I think that's the way we should go, is to approach this as a public health problem, but also to look at the roots of why people are engaging in self-medication and trafficking. And again, that is rooted in poverty, despair, alienation. These are things that need to be addressed in and of their own. Did I address your question? Cooperation, regional cooperation. That's very difficult because you're talking about funding, and there's a lot of gaming involved. If Mexico's getting this money, Guatemala wants a little of the money, then Honduras sees that, and Honduras says, well, we got it. And so it's hard to incentivize cooperation when a lot of bureaucratic incentives are for regional or personal or bureaucratic aggrandizement. You may not believe in the game, but it's money, and that's the only money around, so people start believing in the game.
I think we have time for one quick one, and then they'll have to run up for the train.
Sorry. You've talked about heroin, cocaine, and the crack, but with the new change in drug production, with chemical drugs becoming a big issue, what's going to be put in, or are you already ahead of the game there, or what's going to be put in place to encounter that?
Well, I mean, in terms of trafficking, I mean, I guess, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, there's always been obviously laboratory-produced chemicals. The second of those three drug conventions, the one in '71, is specifically about, essentially sort of laboratory or kitchen-created drugs. There's certainly a lot more press about them now, and because with advances in technology, drugs can change very quickly, or what is actually criminalized in legislation can be modified very slightly on a molecular level to sort of fall on one side, the sort of legal highs question. So one of the things that's changed, I mean, it's what Sana was talking about in plant-based drug economies is the need to traffic across borders or across oceans. A lot of drugs that would be produced through laboratories can be produced domestically. So you have a different kind of economy in terms of health concerns, which would be what the focus of ours. I mean, some have very different health concerns. I mean, most of those would be used non-problematically, but obviously some of those drugs can be injected. Some of them are still of unknown quantity or quality, I should say. People still have health problems related to them. So in that sort of sense, in a public health sense, there's not a whole lot of difference necessarily, but obviously the fact that you can produce a lot of those in your own garage. I mean, people who watch Breaking Bad or something like that, you can see that's, you don't necessarily need a semi-submarine to go across the Gulf of Mexico or something. You can do it in your garage down the road.
And also, they're illegal here, but in the United States we have direct-to-consumer advertising for prescription drugs. And they saturate our airwaves. And there are drugs for this and that. Go bug your doctor, pester them to give you this drug and prescribe that drug. And it's very troubling. It creates a pill culture. That was something that was unheard of when I was growing up in the United States, and now it's commonplace. And it's 24/7. And if you look at these drug ads, they're required to list a lot of the negative consequences. So for a 1-minute ad, 2/3 of that may be just symptoms that are negative symptoms. Yeah. Right? They're required to do that. Yeah. With a lot of these club drugs and designer drugs and synthetics, they call them bath salts. They're not regulated as a pharmaceutical because they're not for human consumption. They're plant fertilizer or whatever you want to call them. But do you see any warnings on any of those things? It's problematic for me to a great extent in that in the United States we have this obsession with drug testing now. Testing children, testing all kinds of, military and just for jobs and security clearances, you get drug tested. And what it does is, rightly or wrongly, people think that they can have a better chance of evading these drug tests if they avoid cannabis and use these so-called legal highs or newer drugs. And they become then the human guinea pigs. We don't know, to the extent that they're tweaking these things at the molecular level to stay one step ahead of the law. We have very little long-term data on this stuff. I would be very hesitant to volunteer as a human guinea pig for people who fly-by-night operations, who stay on the label, not for human consumption. You can't sue them. You can't hold them accountable for anything. Think about it.
Thank you.
Well, I'd just like to thank again everyone for coming, and especially thank both Rick and Sanho for 2 excellent presentations. As mentioned, those of you that want more information, we're doing more and more work. We're developing this area here at the university. So approach me, approach Nancy if you want to know more about this, and we will be, as I said, also advertising the internship on this. But mainly right now, let's just thank both our speakers.